crime itself. Therefore, an indispensable obligation to arrest and to repair the consequences of the monetary and political crimes against us comprises an imperative obligation to arrest terminal failure by immediate adoption of mathematically perfected economy, comprises an imperative obligation to immediately establish absolute consensual representation, and comprises an imperative obligation to commensurably criminalize the breaches of power which have precipitated in these monumental calamities, and therefore comprises an imperative obligation to duly criminalize any resistant to this mandate whatever by any seated power. This is the authority then that we are going to criminalize these crimes to the extent of treason, because, as treason is, they are so destructive to every republic of the world. L. Essence of mathematically perfected economy, adopted from the assessments of fine gentleman Jim Eldon. The very essence of mathematically perfected economy, then, is at once an economic principle and an ethical one. Its principle is that of non-intervention, a principle which is found at the heart of democratic theory. Its conception is an economic analog to the conception of civil liberties, which seeks to guarantee for each individual all those freedoms which are consistent with this same guarantee for every other individual. Its conception is every prospective obligor's right to issue their promise to pay, free of extrinsic manipulation, adulteration, or exploitation of that promise, or the natural opportunity to make good on it. From this perspective, it should be abundantly clear that bankers, as no more than ostensibly legally sanctioned usurers and faux creditors, have no place in a democratic society. They are neither desirable nor necessary. They should be no more welcome than slave owners, political dictators, or murderers. They have no right to insinuate themselves into economic relations as the only purportedly legal arbiters of debt and credit. But having done so, they have impaired every other freedom inherent to the democratic ideal, and continue, therefore, to prevent a truly free market economy from taking shape. M. Undeniable preservation of liberty. Is all this, then, is a consequence of an ever unjustifiable ambition, designed explicitly to perpetrate an ever unwarranted, unassented, and even terminal power to exploit us, by purposed denial of our very right to issue the only possibly legitimate, immutable, and enforceable promissory obligations. Therefore neither liberty, justice, nor prosperity can well be preserved without immediate passage of this mandate. And so, given its intrinsic, irrefutable proofs of cause, singular solution, and singular just means of transformation, then, no sitting government, therefore, shall have any authority whatever, either to debate or to delay it. Section 1.4. Vital extension of means to absolute consensual representation. Indispensable eradication of potential means of commission of crimes against us. As the present crimes against us were imposed by breach of promise, deception, and denial of public affirmation, and as these crimes can only persist above a knowledgeable apprehending public by perpetual breach of promise, deception, and denial of public affirmation. And as these crimes exist, therefore, wholly by breach of authorizable power. Thus, in order to preserve every intent of just rule by consent of the governed, no prospectively conducive means or juncture for affirmation, rejection, or refinement of rule or its consequences can be denied to we the people. B. Indispensable scope of absolute consensual representation. Thus every means of rendering absolute consensual representation prescribed herein shall be exercised not only in all matters henceforth, but in review of the entire body of prior rule, with the natural purpose and consequences of this review understood explicitly to be eradication of a vast body of unjust law, regulation, and government, with a minimal body of remaining law to be consolidated purposely into the least, most just, most economic, and most efficient design, all with the fullest accountability, and indispensably, therefore, with commensurable penalty and liability for the consequences of every violation of common representative principle. Section 2. Indispensable terms, scope, and verification of lawful authority. No authority over the people shall exist, but to preserve every beneficial right to the explicit limits of infringement upon the equal rights of others. And to do so, every conceivable law or regulation shall stand only so long as without exception it is found to meet every demonstrably useful or necessary standard of common representation, including 1. Indispensable reduction of law to common universal principles. In both its entire body and distinct expressions, all law must be distilled to the fewest necessary principles, and no body or case of law shall persist but as most simply and unambiguously represents and realizes those principles. 2. Indispensable establishment of purposes without undeclared, concealed, or inadvertent consequence. All law and ambitions to establish law shall so well set forth their purposes that no class of consequence shall be undeclared, concealed, or inadvertent. No law shall be of any force or legitimacy whatever otherwise. Nor shall any law or political proposition stand to be exercised from the moment it is demonstrated not to serve its declared purposes, or that its purposes do not serve without exception or recognizable possibility of betterment the common and equal rights of all people. No right shall exist which is not granted to every equal extent to all people. 3. Indispensable establishment of most effective and just means. All law shall set forth the most effective and just means of achieving its purposes, and that means shall neither stand nor be exercised from the moment it is demonstrated not to most effectively and justly achieve those purposes. Nor shall any conducive conduit for useful rejection or refinement be denied the people. 4. Restrictive nature of collective purposes. No law, bill, or act shall combine unrelated purposes, and neither proposal, passage, or enforceability shall be decided but by exceeding merits of its means to common supreme purposes. It shall be the recognized lawful obligations of obligation of all citizens of a republic, therefore, in all cases. 1. To vote not for personal or divisive interests, but only for a fact of compliant, undefective, common representation. 2. And to strictly oppose anything and everything less. 3. Citizens, purported authorities, and officers of government negligently deviating from this obligation, therefore, shall be accountable for damages inflicted, including costs of claiming damages. Costs of claiming losing accusations shall fall to the claimants, including compensation for related losses. 5. Inherent illegality of quorums. No reduced quorum, regardless of ostensible authority, shall be deemed to have passed any government act. The Federal Reserve System was passed into existence in predominant absence of everyone who opposed it on the eve of December 23, 1913. So we're outlawing this from ever happening again. No legislative passage, therefore, shall exist without a lawful majority of no less than half of the entire possible legislative vote, with unexercised votes counting always against election or passage. 6. Indispensability of public affirmation and reaffirmation in actual consensual representation. No law or resultant process or power shall be exercised without final public affirmation by a lawful majority of the people, and no law or resultant process or power shall remain in force without periodic public reaffirmation by no less than a lawful majority, which in no case shall be less than half of the affected or lawfully deciding public, whichever is greater, and which reaffirmation shall transpire both regularly and upon incident, as will suffice to eradicate injustice and transgression. 7. No power to pardon abuse of power. No power to pardon abuse of power or breach of legal authority shall exist. Any agent of abuse of power or breach of authority shall be liable for all damages inflicted, however indirect or remote. You can imagine how this will make anyone who thinks of breaching power think twice about it very, very seriously, because apprehension is inevitable and the consequences nullify any possible benefit and worse. And the supporters of any cause or obstruction of necessary cause shall be held responsible and liable for their influence in resultant incongruities, damages, and defects as documented by obligatory public voting records. Voting, therefore, shall effectively be an obligation of representative government by consent of the government, with a right to implicitly vote against all subject issues honored in the case of intentional absence, and not absolving the voter from accountability except by inadvertent absence, and therefore with no right to vote carelessly or to evade responsibility for voting carelessly to exist. Section 3. Confirmability of election processes, responsibility for consequences thereof, disposition of oaths of office, and of civil or legal representation. To ensure enforceable integrity of elections and determinable responsibility for their effects, voting records shall be public, shall be readily accessible, shall be verifiable by all participants and affected parties, and shall be permanent for no less than 100 years or whatever extent they may remain of concern, whichever the greater. Willful subversion, destruction, alteration, or obstruction of such records or counts, or subversion of necessary processes shall be treason.